Hi, I'm Hugo Gurdon, Editor-in-Chief of the Washington Examiner, and I'm really excited to be joining you at the Washington Examiner Election Summit. We'd love to be doing this in person, but like everything these days, it's being done by video conference. And that's not going to diminish at all the great conversation we're going to have. If we're going to talk about elections, who better to have with us than the great Karl Rove? And Karl, it's fantastic to have you with us to talk about the election, which is now days and weeks away, not just months.
Yeah. It may seem like it's an election that's taken a century, but that's because we're living in dog political years now.
That's right. So, Karl, the biggest question for everybody is obviously they want to know how it's going to go, and none of us knows for sure. But what I was hoping to get from you right up at the top is a kind of unvarnished picture. Is the election slipping away from President Trump? The polls don't look good, but there are maybe 3 to 4 weeks to go.
Yeah, there are 26 days as you and I talk, but look, he is behind in the polls, and he's been so most of the year. His being stricken with coronavirus is not going to have helped him. It has caused a lot of people who like what he's done to say to themselves, well, you know what, he misplayed this. Even he got sick. He should have been more serious about it. My gut tells me that other things are going to cause people to sort of say, well, okay, that's now behind us. But a great deal of how it gets behind us, I think, is going to be how the president handles this in the next several days and in the next debate. Does he demonstrate a certain humility about this? I thought one of the most powerful moments was as he was leaving for Walter Reed, he stopped in the diplomatic room and did a taping. And the footage, and he said, I'm doing all right, I think. I'm feeling okay, I'm doing okay, I think. But anybody who faced this kind of a serious health threat, the American people are going to want to see that humanity, and I think it will help him, frankly.
Yeah, the president sometimes shows that level of sort of humanity and occasional sort of almost humility, which doesn't really go with the persona that most people have. But one of the things you just said, which I think is absolutely right, I wanted to sort of maybe expand on, is you're saying soon this might be in the past. It reminds me of, there was a British prime minister who once said the thing he feared most was events. And 2020 has been like that. I mean, we were dominated by COVID for months, which probably hurt the president quite a bit on his handling. But then the focus changed to race and then to riots. And that maybe helped Trump because he could depict himself as the law and order president. Then suddenly we're talking about the Supreme Court, and then that gets blown away by the president getting COVID. So the question I have is, was there anything Trump could do to control the election year narrative better, or have events simply been overwhelming?
Well, Harold Macmillan, the prime minister you quoted, was right. It's one of my favorite quotes too, because events do intrude. It's how you handle the events. And so if I could get in the Wayback Machine and go back, I would counsel the president and the people around him to have a more disciplined approach to messaging, because things do intrude. And how a president is able to handle those, how he's able to express himself, is really critical. The president's messaging has been uneven at times, very uneven.
Yeah.
But it's amazing to me too, because particularly I've gotten sort of, I won't go into a rant, but the president has done extraordinarily amazing things on this coronavirus. I was in the White House in 2002 and 2003 when we faced the possibility of SARS, again, a virus from China. And I remember going to those briefings, and they were some of the scariest briefings I attended at the White House. You go to these briefings and you'd realize how little we know about how this disease is going to move, what the ramifications are, how rapidly or not it's going to spread. And I remember listening to the briefer, a guy from the National Institutes of Health named Anthony Fauci, and listening to him say, in essence, we have to be ready for all possibilities, because we don't know the shape, the form, the duration, the size, the shape, the method, the distribution, the movement, the speed of how this disease is going to play out. Right. And yet the president has done, and to my mind, an extraordinary job, surrounded by people like Fauci and Redfield at the CDC and Azar at the Health and Human Services, and done extraordinary things. We have.
One of the things that struck me is that he was actually treated for his infection with a therapeutic treatment developed under Operation Warp Speed, which was a thing he initiated in May. Now, he presumably didn't think that when he started it back in May, that he was going to be needing it himself. But that shows what has actually been done in the past 5 months.
By contrast, and this is what gets me into my rant, if you go back and take a look at what Joe Biden was saying at the time, which was not very much, and what Joe Biden's advisors were saying at the time, which is more,
right.
They didn't have a handle on this. Remember, the president says wisely, we're going to not allow people from China to come into our country.
Right.
And the next day, Biden says it's xenophobic and racist. Later, he opposes the ban on travel from Europe, which was a hot spot. Right. In between, we had the advisors to Biden, Erwin Rhinelander, who said the likelihood of this becoming a global pandemic with catastrophic deaths is, quote, highly unlikely. Ron Klain attacked the president in February because, quote, we don't have a pandemic, a health pandemic, we have a fear pandemic. He was criticizing the president for raising people's fears. Zeke Emanuel, on the day that the first American dies, is on CNN and says, quote, don't run out and get a mask, they don't do any good. And the vice president on March 13th gives a speech in which on the crisis, in which the words mask, social distancing, and lockdowns don't appear. In fact, in June, I think it is, or maybe it's July, when he appears on Joy Reid's first program, she tosses him a softball and says, what would you do if you were president? What will you do next January if you're president? And he says 6 things, all of which Trump had done. Now, I don't fault him for not being able to perfectly call out what was going to happen, but there's a certain humility that ought to be there that isn't. I mean, he's Monday morning quarterback. Right. And I do think one of the faults in messaging is that appropriate people, not necessarily the president, but in the debate, now the president ought to call him out for Monday morning quarterbacking.
Right. Let's talk about, Carl, let's just move to Joe Biden for a minute. You know, you've worked in the Bush White House. You've seen how much this takes out of the man in charge. In that context, what do you make of Joe Biden's obvious mental decline and the possible consequences of that? I mean, how do you view that whole subject?
Well, look, I'm not a doctor, and I didn't even stay in a Holiday Inn last night. I'm in a Marriott. But it worries me a lot. He is clearly he's clearly in decline. There have been moments in which he couldn't string together 2 sentences. He does well in the debates because they prepare him for them. But it means a couple things. If he were to get elected, the people around him would matter a lot.
Right.
The vice president would matter a lot, and she is not. You know, there's a reason why Marianne Williamson and Yang and Julian Castro and Pete Buttigieg all lasted in the Democratic presidential primary much, much longer than Kamala Harris did. She was a lousy candidate, and she's got a paper-thin resume in the U.S. Senate, and is really one of the less attractive people I've ever seen in politics. There's a certain edge to that woman, you know, yes or no, Hugo, yes or no. I mean, that seems to be her pattern in the congressional committees in which she appears. So, you know, but I worry about it because of Biden himself. I'm mystified by his campaign. He got the nomination because he was the traditional Democrat.
Right.
So why did he then immediately turn around and form the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force? And why is he sort of trying to appease the far left of his party? That's not who he was in the Congress, but now he's compelled to do that.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask you about that. I mean, normally the candidates in the primary go out to the extreme to capture their base, and then they tack back to the center in order to for the general election. Biden has done the exact opposite. He won the primary by being sort of more centrist, although I wouldn't say he was in the center. And then he tacked out to the extreme to capture the Bernie Sanders army. I wanted to ask you, is he a stalking horse for the left? I mean, is there genuine reason to worry about socialist extremism escalating if he wins?
Well, yes, I think so. And I say that not lightly because he is a traditional Democrat. And yet the things that he's done since then either demonstrate that he is desperate to maintain his popularity among the left and thinks that's the key to the election, or that people around him are saying, you've got to do this in order to win and in order to govern. And in either case, it ain't a pretty picture. And you're right. Richard Nixon was the author of the theory that you go to the right if you're a Republican, left if you're a Democrat, and then come back to the center. I've always thought that that was a weird theory because what it assumes is nobody is paying attention.
Right.
But actually, they're paying attention. That's why Reagan's great conceit was, I'm going to be who I am, win the nomination, and run in the general election as myself instead of some artifice. And here we have here we have Joe Biden saying, I'm going to be who I am in the primaries, and then I'm going to be somebody else in the general election. And people are not going to be confused with that. The Joe Biden that I saw for decades in Washington would not have had difficulty saying that the violence in Portland and Seattle and Chicago was reprehensible, and the perpetrators ought to be found and prosecuted. But now it's like, I won't criticize those people because I'm afraid of upsetting the lunatic left of my party. That's not what America needs at this time in its history.
Karl, is there? Yeah, I think that whole law and order issue is one which will. I mean, I think that one saw it somewhat in the polls when it was, a few weeks ago, that there was some sort of movement away from Biden, or perhaps a bit, because of weeks and weeks and weeks and months of violence in the cities. Is there a silent majority of support for Trump? He often says there is. Some pollsters say it's a myth. What's your take? Is there kind of an army of supporters who are going to kind of emerge from the woods and who have not been detected and who will be backing Trump, do you think?
There is a sort of the American equivalent of shy Toryism. I mean, I think there are people in America. It was about just over 1%. And if you accept the last polls were accurate reflection of the popular opinion, then there's just over about 1% of the population that in 2016 were voting for Trump who were refusing to say it to pollsters. So that's about just over 2% of the Trump vote was there. My suspicion is it's slightly larger this time, but it's not 6 or 7 or 8. It's probably 2 or 3. But yeah, I bet there are people out there that say, I'm not telling.
Right. One of the questions I want to ask you is sort of a cultural thing, and it also goes to the fact that you're a political historian. And by the way, I greatly enjoyed your book on McKinley. I want to ask about, has there historically ever been a time that you're aware of where, I walk around my neighborhood, let's say, and you see signs which are not just declaring their support for Biden or for Trump, but they're kind of itemizing the list of beliefs that household has, that we believe that Black Lives Matter and that, love is love.
I believe in science, yeah.
And at the same time, we also hear about conservatives in particular being reluctant to reveal what they genuinely think. It's a kind of dichotomy where people are just parading their views in a way which I haven't experienced, and yet at the same time concealing them, or other people are concealing them. I mean, is this historically precedented or not?
Oh yeah, we've had this before. I mean, we've had moments where it was politically impolite to oppose FDR, for example.
Right.
The election of 1896, which you referenced in the McKinley book.
Right.
One of the things that the Republicans wisely did was they made it apolitical. So at the end of the campaign, they had a thing called Flag Day, in which they encouraged the Republican legions across the country to hold parades and celebrations of the American flag. And William Jennings Bryan said to fellow Democrats, put out a flag so that the bosses don't know where the working man who's opposed to them is. So we've had this at times before. But it's also, I live in a sort of a liberal town, Austin, Texas. It's a blueberry in the middle of a Red Sea. But in my neighborhood, we've got some of those signs, but we also are now starting to see, we appreciate the Austin Police Department.
Right.
And I'm going to get one of those signs, but they're all in my neighborhood. And in Austin, Texas, the city council unanimously cut the police budget dramatically. And the leader of that effort, a council member, wants to literally blow up the police headquarters, to implode it as a sign of the new spirit in Austin. And of course, he wants the police department to be decentralized with a unelected citizens committee of 3 overseeing every police department. I'm waiting for him to suggest the workers' Soviets to be organized so that we're Petrograd 1917. But look, in politics, for every reaction, there is a reaction. Right. And the brazen, left philosophy of the left that's being shoved down a lot of people's throats is is going to generate a counter reaction. And I think we're seeing it first and foremost over the issue of defunding the police.
Right. Let's talk about the Supreme Court for a minute. I mean, it goes to that point that you were just making about the extremism of the left and the reaction. Does the Supreme Court fight help or hurt President Trump? Because it clearly fires up the base, both his base and the base that's against him.
Well, I'll tell you what I said at the beginning of this when the Ruth Bader Ginsburg death was when she died and the president was examining who he might appoint. I said, this is going to energize the base of each party. So Democrats are going to get revved up, Republicans are going to get revved up, but that group in the middle that's going to make up sort of the swing election vote, they're either weakly linked to their candidate, be it Trump or Biden, or they're truly undecided, or they can change their minds. They're going to be impacted by the quality of the nominee. Right. And I got to tell you, I think by election day, Amy Coney Barrett is just going to be a definite plus. I mean, what a terrific persona,
right?
What a great record, what a great presentation. Yeah. And she is blessed with that most important of things, really stupid enemies who attacked her for, how dare she adopt these two children from Haiti? She should have left them in squalor and hunger and desperation and uneducated. She should have left them there. How dare she be a Catholic?
Right.
And how dare she care about the beliefs of her church and live them in her personal life? This was a woman who was a Supreme Court clerk. And when she was nominated to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, every Supreme Court clerk with whom she served, which had to be 20 some odd people, nearly 30 people, conservatives and liberals both unanimously endorsed her for the bench, saying this is exactly the kind of legal scholar and good character and integrity-filled individual we want on the bench.
Yeah, that's the cover of the magazine, the Washington Examiner magazine this week. There's we have a nice illustration of her and the people like Schumer and Pelosi and Harris and Biden all sort of flinching and sort of reeling away from her with the headline, "What's not to like?" I mean, she's a brilliant theorist and she's a lovely person. So of course the Democrats absolutely hate her.
Right. We ought to be trying to judge these people by, do they have the character and the integrity and the scholarship to be a justice, no matter who nominates them.
Right. A big controversy, perhaps obscured a little bit now, but no doubt it's going to come back, is about voting by mail. And I wanted to ask you what the truth about that is. Some people say voter fraud is a big deal. Others say it's not. What do you think the truth about voter fraud is, and would mail-in voting on the scale that we're likely to see make it worse?
Yeah, well, I think there is a certain amount of fraud. I think it's modest. I think it's small, but I think in close elections it could be potent. Right. And so, for example, remember in New Mexico, Bush lost it the first time by several hundred votes and won it the second time by just over 1,000 votes. There was a gigantic expose by Albuquerque TV of a vast number of fraudulent registrations. It was discovered by a vice cop whose son, 14-year-old son, got a voter registration card unasked for in the mail. And he talked to people in the press, and they did a news conference because the local TV station examined it and found out there were a bunch of new registrations on the Bernalillo County, Albuquerque voter registration file that were fraudulent. People, the Smiths were registered at the Gomez's household, and the Sanchez's were registered at the Jones's household, and a bunch of people registered at the address of a culvert along the interstate. People were, it was nutty. And as luck would have it, and it was so bad that the Bernalillo County clerk, a Democrat, and the Bernalillo County sheriff, a Republican, both jointly asked for a federal investigation because they were both deeply concerned about what was happening. As luck would have it, just before the election, the vice cop is on a drug raid, and they bust a drug house. And in there, they find a couple of really bad guys, including a guy with fraudulent voter registration cards and absentee ballots in his possession, who is a Cuban national on the payroll of a voter registration effort that, if I recall correctly, was being underwritten by George Soros. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. But having said that, look, voter fraud is a small problem today. It could be a bigger problem tomorrow if we do what which some jurisdictions wanted to do, which is mail everybody on the voter registration file, even if they're so-called inactive voters.
Both sides have been talking in a way which sort of undermines faith in the coming election. There are people who talk that a constitutional crisis is coming. The Democrats saying that President Trump is not going to accept the result of the election. He's saying there's going to be a disaster with the fraud. Who's more to blame for? Is it Republicans or Democrats who are more to blame for undermining faith in the result?
Everybody does, and let's be honest, everybody. And I mean, I got an email the other day from President Obama talking about voter suppression, that we saw Republican voter suppression during the primaries in Georgia. Well, what he's talking about is long lines at Forsyth and DeKalb counties because the local election authorities didn't have enough machines for people to vote on. Well, guess who's in charge of those two counties? One county commission is 6-1 Democrat, and the other one is 4-3 Democrat, and each of them has a Democrat as the head of the elections chief, and it's Democrats who are responsible, but President Obama is blaming it on Republicans. Same thing happened in an historic black college in Houston called Texas Southern during the primaries. Long lines, they had to keep the polls open until midnight to allow everybody to vote. And they blamed it on the Republicans, despite the fact that elections are by and large administered at the local level. And in the case of counties in Texas, it's the district court clerk who is a Democrat in Harris County. And they screwed up the elections, and yet they blame it. Now, having said that, we got two problems we better deal with. One is we have a lot more people voting by mail this year.
Right.
And there are two problems with vote by mail. There are a few states that allow people to send in their ballots and have them postmarked by election day. And some states, one state allows the ballots to be received by the 13th, 10 days after the election. Pennsylvania, the law requires that they be received by the close of the polls on election day, but the Democrat Supreme Court of Pennsylvania it said, we're going to ignore the clear mandate of the state law and allow them to be received 3 days after. And if there's no postmark or the postmark is illegible, we're going to assume that they were mailed before the deadline unless, quote, the preponderance of evidence suggests otherwise. So that's one problem, is the states that allow ballots to be received after the election day. The other problem is this. You have to verify that ballot. You have to compare the signatures. You have to process it, make certain that it's valid. 3 states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Now, are those familiar? They all don't allow the election authorities to begin processing those ballots until the polls are closed. Now, when you had a small percentage of your vote being cast by mail, that's one thing. But when you're going to have a huge percentage of the cast by mail, as in this election, that's a problem. Florida, 22 days out, you can begin doing it. Other states, it's upon the receipt of the ballot. North Carolina allows the local election authorities to decide when they begin processing. But 4 states, the 3 I mentioned, plus Iowa, that doesn't allow you to do it until the day before the election. And I should have tossed in there Maine. Maine is also, you can't do it until the election day. These are all battleground states. And as a result, it may be days or maybe even weeks before we know what the results are in those states. That's problematic.
Yeah, it is a problem. Let's just, we haven't got a lot of time. Let's just briefly talk about the House and the Senate. Back last fall, when you and I were at Sea Island, we were, one of the other speakers there was Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and he seemed confident that the math was, made Republican majority likely this coming election. Things haven't gone that way, or don't seem to be going that way. But is that still possible? Could the House, could the Republicans take the House, do you think?
Well, his job is to be optimistic, and he is a strong leader. I doubted it back then. I doubt it today. I think the Republicans will make gains.
And what about the Senate? Will Republicans manage to hold the Senate, do you think, or is that looking like it's disappearing?
I think it all depends upon what we've got. Good candidates running good campaigns, but at the end of the day, the question is going to be, does the president carry Alaska, Montana, Arizona, Colorado, Iowa, North Carolina, Georgia, Maine, or most of those states? I don't think he's going to carry Colorado and Maine, but I think in the others, Arizona, Alaska, Montana, Iowa, North Carolina, and Georgia, it almost requires the president to win those states for us to win. We're in an era where 97% of the time, the winner of a Senate race in a presidential election year is of the party of the candidate who wins that state. Right. So we got a battle ahead of us.
Yeah. Okay, Carl. Final question, and it might sound naive to ask it because I remember I remember seeing the hostility, for example, towards Richard Nixon. But you're a historian. Has there ever been a president who faced more active hostility than President Trump?
It'd be hard to figure one out. Maybe Nixon,
Mhm.
and particularly in the second term. But no, I mean, the media, it's amazing. You're a journalist. You represent the excellence of journalists who try and be the objective observers and reporters of facts. Could you ever imagine the Washington Examiner having a revolt of the 24-year-old digital assistants who are saying you wrote a neutral headline about Donald Trump? That's what happened at the New York Times. They said you should have written a negative headline. You wrote a neutral headline. And there is the head of the New York Times bowing and scraping and apologizing as if he is in a Mao re-education camp to the underlings at the New York Times for having had a neutral headline. That's the kind of hostility we see. I read the New York Times, but I have to take blood pressure medicine. I'm very low pressure. But I mean, it's just amazing to me how it is advocacy only thinly disguised as journalism.
Right. Karl Rove, look, it's been great. No better person to have here for insights and knowledge about elections. It's been a delight to have you here. Thanks for joining me.
You bet. Thank you, Hugo. A delight to be with you.